Hey everybody, Happy New Year. It is 2019 and welcome back to another episode of Hail State Debate, the YouTube channel where us folks here at Mississippi State University in beautiful Starkville, Mississippi, talk about all the new Lincoln Douglas and public forum topics because we think debate is awesome. We want more people to be able to do it, to be successful at it, and have fun with it. You may have noticed it's just me here for this video. As I'm shooting this, we are on holiday break. Luke is at home enjoying a well-deserved break after finals, so I'm going to try to slog through this on my own. Apologies, it's coming a little late. Not only am I having to record it all, I'm having to edit all of this one by myself, which I'm not really very good at, so apologies if it's not as strong as it could be. But I think we've got some good stuff to talk about. Looking at the January-February LD resolution resolved, the United States ought not provide military aid to authoritarian regimes. As always, if you like it, if it proves useful, maybe give us a like, maybe subscribe, maybe tell a friend. If there's something you'd like to know that we didn't talk about, drop it in the questions or comments below. Something we could do better, let us know that too. Also, there is one new announcement, which is that we are now on Twitter. We realized after we dropped a lot of these videos that we would come up with ideas, we would see sources, we would see things that we wish we'd included like a few days or even weeks later, especially on LD where the topics run a little bit longer. But we couldn't go back and do another video. That's just like too much work. We just didn't have time to do it. So we added the Twitter so we could sort of update it periodically, just a few tweets a month, you know, about new sources, new ideas, new topics, maybe talking about voting on topics at the end of the year, you know, maybe just little notes about strategy. If we see a good article about LD, we might drop it in there. It is not us talking about our own tournaments. That's a different Twitter, so don't worry, we're not going to inundate you. But if you think those updates might be useful, we are at Hail State Debate, so give us a follow and we will keep you up to date. So real quick overview. I think this is a good topic. You know, I think we've been kind of like all over the map this year on topics in LD and PF, some very broad, some very narrow, some really good ones. Some, frankly, in LD that have been, you know, a little repetitive, maybe not worded as well as they could be. But I think we're starting off 2019 on a really good note. The main thing you want with any topic is balance, and I think this one has a very good balance. It's very clear what we're talking about. I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of definitional fighting on this like there is in the PF resolution, so that's good. Also, while it's not symmetrical, in other words, while both sides aren't going to argue the same way, I think overall it is very well balanced, and I think as long as both sides have one or more clear potential routes to victory, that's a good resolution, and I think that's definitely the case here. So good job, topic committee. Good job, those of us who voted on it. You know, I think if, for example, you're the AF, you have a couple of options, right? You can go with more of a consequentialist argument because there's a lot of evidence out there about how harmful military aid has been in these authoritarian regimes, how it's propped up countries that are doing awful things, places like Saudi Arabia and Yemen, how it makes these problems worse, you know, and those are consequentialist utilitarian arguments about, you know, what makes the world a better place, what makes people suffer less. That's one valid route. Another route, of course, is a more sort of deontological, absolute right and wrong, categorical imperative kind of argument, right? That aiding these regimes is just an inherently immoral action to take. We shouldn't be in the business of enabling dictators to oppress and kill their own people. Either way, there's a great body of literature out there, right? There's a lot of good folks writing on this subject, and you're going to have a lot of options at your disposal to write a really strong case. Now, the neg would actually have a really hard time if it just had to sort of square up to that, right, and say, no, military aid to authoritarian regimes has just been great. It's had a fantastic track record. It's worked out really well. You know, if we could do it all again, we would do it the same way. That's a really hard sell, right? There have been numerous examples of how it's been disastrous and counterproductive, and it's enabled these countries to do really awful things that we don't want to be associated with. But as with a lot of good resolutions, the neg actually has several vantage points kind of around the periphery, or it can sort of take shots at the AF and pick away at the AF from what I would call sort of a flanking position, right? Rather than running straight at the AF, it can take a more strategic position kind of off to the side. For example, arguably, right, the resolution makes a pretty categorical statement about what we should not be doing with respect to authoritarian regimes. Right? And so one argument that the neg can make, if it prepares properly, is to say, look, we don't necessarily endorse the military aid that's gone on. We think, however, that you ought to be taking it on a case-by-case basis. That's the correct interpretation of the wording of the resolution, right? That's the best way to come at this. So at the end of the resolution, we're not going to necessarily say we agree with any particular instance of past military aid. What we're going to say is that the AF has a duty to show you we should never do it. And if we can show you instances where it is effective and it makes the problems less bad and it makes things better, right? Basically, sometimes we might have to deal with nasty people to prevent even more nasty people, like even worse things from happening. That's the real world. That's what we have to deal with as grown-ups. And maybe not in every case, but if we can show you it's a case-by-case decision that we should make one by one, right? Rather than a categorical no, we will never deal with bad people, which is kind of, the neg would say, that's kind of a naive way to view the world. Well, then the neg can have a strong position. There's also evidence that the current policy status quo either works or could be made to work. I was really surprised in reading a lot of the writing about this topic so far. Nobody or very few people are really mentioning the Leahy Law, right? Which is a law passed in 1997 that actually already prohibits the United States from providing military aid to military units in countries that engage in human rights violations. Now, it's far from a perfect law, and there is an argument that it's not really being enforced, but there's a strong argument that the neg can make that either it is working to some extent, there's some evidence on that, or B, maybe a counter plan. All you need to do is to actually enforce the Leahy Law, and it would provide a better means for solving these problems. You don't need to completely get rid of aid to authoritarian countries. So there's a sort of status quo is working, or at least the status quo could work. And then finally, even though I'm not the biggest fan of sort of critical negatives in the world, I think there's a really good critical angle here to take. Critical meaning looking at the language carefully and pointing out how it can be problematic. I think there's a good argument that the term authoritarian regimes is just so hopelessly vague and loaded and gives U.S. policymakers so much discretion, and it's so loaded with bias that it's a really problematic thing to endorse. For example, authoritarian regimes being the line for military aid would basically say that a regime that's not democratic but really doesn't abuse human rights all that badly couldn't get any aid, whereas Israel, right, which is a liberal democracy but does engage in human rights violations of Palestinians, would be just perfectly fine. Right? So drawing the line based on authoritarian regimes, which is really vague and loaded and, maybe has some problematic connotations, that's, I think, another good option for the negative. So bottom line, the AF kind of has the sort of big, defensible, strong fortress that it can guard, and the negative has like a lot of little places that it can come at and sort of try to ambush the AF. So I think it's going to be a fun, if somewhat asymmetrical resolution. As usual, the order of the video will be, first we'll do an overview of just some basic points about the topic so that we're all talking the same language. Second, we'll do definitions, values, and criteria. Third, affirmative arguments. Fourth, negative arguments. And then some final thoughts. So without further ado, we will get started right now. Okay, so let's start out with an overview of the topic as it exists sort of in the real world. Why do we do these overviews? Why don't we go straight to like the evidence and the values and the criteria? Because the overwhelming majority of judges, whether they are a very experienced judge, a brand new lay judge, whoever it might be, want to see a debater who has some real world knowledge, who seems literate, who seems intelligent. It's just intuitively a lot easier to vote for a person when he or she sounds like they know what they're talking about. And by the way you do that is to read, and read some more. Not just read the stuff that's going in your case, not just read the cards that you're going to cut as rebuttals, but the more you read on this subject, the more literate you sound, the better you're going to be. Obviously, we can't substitute for that in a 1-hour video, but we can at least get generally on the same page and understand a little bit about how this topic kind of manifests itself in the real world, just to provide some context. So, the image that the United States wants to promote of itself, particularly you guys are in school, among folks in school and students, is that we are the good guys. We are a beacon of global freedom and democracy, and we stand firmly opposed to any form of authoritarianism or totalitarianism. The reality, and there are a lot of ways to challenge that reality, of course. I mean, there are countless ones we could talk about, but one way in which that reality has to be challenged is the fact that the United States has done business with a lot of nasty people over the years, right? With the justification being that sometimes you have to deal with bad folks because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So, for example, look at the Middle East with us arming the Mujahideen, who would later become, for example, the Taliban. Look to Latin America, funneling arms to Sandinistas and other rebels who did really horrific things in some instances that we were in some ways complicit with. If you name a violent bad actor around the world, as long as they weren't a communist, right? It's basically a coin flip to see whether the United States has helped them out at some point historically. And the argument is just sometimes we're going to have to deal with dictators, killers, bad people in general, to keep even worse dictators and even worse killers and even worse human rights violators at bay. So, as I mentioned, for example, back in the 1980s, the CIA was arming and training thousands of Mujahideen rebels in Afghanistan to fight pro-Soviet forces. Now, ultimately, you would say that the Soviet Union didn't end up controlling Afghanistan. Of course, the Soviet Union didn't end up existing because it collapsed. But the training and the arms we provided stopped the takeover of this key strategic area by a country that we were rivals with, right? Unfortunately, a lot of those arms and a lot of that training went on to create the radical Islamic forces that exist in the region today in the form of the Taliban and other radical groups. Now, this isn't going to be an example you'll use in this case per se because the Mujahideen was not a regime, it wasn't a government, but it's just an illustration of how we have been willing in numerous cases throughout history to work with folks who we knew were going to do bad things because they were going to go up against, other folks who we thought did worse things. There are plenty of examples of actual nation states that would be topical in this case. For example, in Saudi Arabia, there is a growing consensus. This is a country we provide arms and arms assistance to. There is a growing consensus that our military aid and our aid in general is helping fuel what arguably is a genocidal war in Yemen, where countless innocent civilians are being victimized and killed. It's helping prop up a prince, a leader who has clearly murdered his political opponents in the case of Jamal Khashoggi. And so, that's a serious problem. There's Egypt, where our aid has helped prop up a dictatorship or a near dictatorship, or several in a row, actually, that engages in, extrajudicial killings, engages in political repression. There's the Philippines, where we're arguably moving to a state where we're going to be doing that in the future with Duterte. Further, there's a strong consensus in the academic literature that overall this aid is not improving, the lives of people in the region. It's not, leading to leverage that would make these countries more democratic, make them more tolerant, make them more respecting of human rights. If anything, it's actually making things worse. And we'll talk about evidence later about how our aid seems to correlate with more violence and not less. And then worst of all, there is also a strong consensus that this aid isn't even achieving the goals we've set for it. The sort of practical, realpolitik goals of influencing these countries and getting them to do what we want, there's evidence that that's kind of a coin flip too. It's not really clear that the military aid that we provide achieves that purpose, right? But there's always two sides to a story. There's a reason why this is a debate resolution, and that is that there are historical examples of aiding authoritarian regimes that almost everybody would agree was justified because the alternative was worse. And the most famous example would be the United States' alliance with the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin to defeat Hitler and the Third Reich. Right? Of course, now you might say, well, the United States was a direct participant in World War II, and that's true. But even before we entered the war in late 1941, we approved something called the Lend-Lease Act in March of 1941, and by which we sent food, supplies, oil, and most importantly, weapons and military equipment to all the allies, including the Soviet Union. The United States provided countless thousands of planes, jeeps, guns, ammunition, and other materials to the Soviet Union under Stalin so that they could fend off the Nazis' eastern advance. Frankly, I'm a little surprised this example hasn't come up in any of the stuff I've been noting about this topic yet. I think it's extremely important. And of course, at the time, we know that Stalin was calling him an authoritarian is almost too kind. Stalin was a brutal dictator. We know that he systemically murdered his own political opponents, anyone suspected of being his political opponent. We know that he set up a system of prisons that were effectively death camps called gulags. We know that millions upon millions of his own people died in his purges. And of course, there was no dissent. There was no opposition to Stalin permitted. But what we also know is that in 1941, Adolf Hitler was intent on invading most of Europe and trying to unite it under his genocidal fascist umbrella. He was, in very simple terms, going about the business of trying to take over the world. And as bad as Stalin was, and as authoritarian and repressive as he wasn't an immediate threat to try to take over the entire continent. So when Hitler invaded Russia and was invading all these other countries, even before the United States entered the war, we provided military aid to an authoritarian, and almost nobody would say that that was wrong. Most everyone could agree that under those difficult circumstances, it was the right thing to do, because as bad as the Cold War with Russia would be, as bad as the Soviet Union could be, as many people as it killed, a world in which the Nazis won World War II would be even worse. Sometimes you have to work with bad people to stop even worse people. And it's interesting because we literally built a monument in Alaska to providing military aid to authoritarians. It's a monument to the Lend-Lease Act's provision of materials and the shipping of them through Alaska to Russia. So we literally have a statue of this controversial thing that we're talking about in this topic. And broadly speaking, I think these are the two competing narratives that we're going to be talking about throughout the course of this resolution, right? On the one hand, the AF is going to say, look, military aid to authoritarian governments props up brutal dictatorship. It makes the U.S. morally complicit in the actions of these regimes. And even worse, it doesn't accomplish its own practical strategic goals in most cases. It doesn't promote democracy. It doesn't save lives. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that it costs lives. It doesn't make countries more stable. It makes them less stable. And, it should be obvious, if you give more money to charity, you're going to get more charitable acts. If you pay more money to Apple, they're going to make more Apple products. And if you give more money to brutal dictatorships, right, for their militaries, you're going to get more brutal dictatorship. But somehow we've talked ourselves into this delusion that if we just keep giving them enough money, eventually, for guns and ammo and weapons and training, that eventually they'll come around and see our way of things. And the empirical evidence says, no, they won't. If anything, they're going to get worse. The negatives narrative is grow up. Don't be so naive, right? The world isn't black and white. It's all different shades of gray. And sometimes you have to work with bad people to stop even worse people. That's why we grant immunity to criminals who will serve as witnesses against their criminal colleagues. That's why we helped Stalin in World War II. That's why we help, for example, countries in sub-Saharan Africa with bad human rights records, because they're fighting terrorists who would be even worse, who would just burn the state down entirely, right? It's why we help Egypt, basically trading military aid for continued peace with Israel, navigation, the right to fly over that country, the right to use it as a platform, right? Giving Egypt $1.3 billion in aid is actually completely worth it. It's not like they'd be behaving differently if we didn't do it. We're buying their favor. We're buying their complicity and their assistance, right? And that's helping us make the world a safer place. So let's be grown-ups about this and not insist that we can never work with bad people, because if that's the case, we just can't exist as a global power. You have to do that sometimes, right? So it's going to be a fun resolution, tension between practicality and ideals. I think is going to be a lot of fun. So with that, let's now finally get into the actual LD debate discussion and talk about definitions, values, and criteria. Okay, so definitions. Let's start with the idea of authoritarian regimes, or more specifically just authoritarian. This is an incredibly vague term, right? Authoritarian is a word that we sort of throw at each other as an insult, even within the United States itself. One party calling the other party, saying that they have authoritarian tendencies. This vagueness, by the way, we'll come back to this a little later. It may be an argument in itself for the negative, a sort of critical argument about why, because the term authoritarian regimes is so vague and in some cases so loaded and so sort of arbitrary, that it might be like too problematic to use as the line of demarcation for determining who gets military aid. So that might be sort of a clever kind of critical negative to use, but we nonetheless have to define it, right? And any definition that you use is going to include some degree of vagueness or leeway, because we're talking about a descriptor that has to describe dozens, if not potentially hundreds of countries. Well, dozens really. But it's interesting, as I've read through some of the stuff on this topic, that a number of folks have just sort of happily included cards and evidence about countries that are really not authoritarian, right? And I'm not going to name any names, but you have to be careful with this, or at least debatably are not authoritarian, right? You have to be very careful with this, because this is a subject on which you can really get sidetracked. You write a great case, it's heavily dependent on evidence about country X, you're ready to defend everything about the case in terms of your affirmative, And then you get sidetracked spending the entire round debating with someone about whether or not country X is truly authoritarian. And because the term authoritarian is so squishy, there's potential for that in almost every round, right? I mean, there are scholars out there who are absolutely arguing right now that under the Trump administration, the United States is an authoritarian country. Now, that's a stretch. That's probably not something that would win the day in any serious discussion, but the mere fact that it's being discussed should tell you that if you go too far afield into these risky territories, you're going to have people, and especially if you rely too much on one country or one or two countries, you really do run the risk of having someone sort of call you out on, is this an authoritarian regime, right? So erring on the side of caution and going with just the, especially when you're on the app, going mainly with examples of just countries that pretty clearly are authoritarian. In other words, if anybody is, these countries are. Or even better than that, relying mainly on evidence that talks about countries in the aggregate, that studies countries together and collectively so that the status of any one country in particular doesn't matter so much. These may be smart strategies. But even so, we have to define the term. So you could go with something relatively straightforward, like this definition from Britannica.com. Authoritarianism denotes a political system that concentrates power in the hands of a leader or a small elite. They exercise power arbitrarily. They don't really rely on rule of law. They don't generally have free elections. That's a perfectly serviceable definition. You might go with something longer and more multi-pronged, like the definition from a political scientist Juan Linz, who is well regarded in the history of sort of defining authoritarianism. But, you know, you do need to be aware that whatever you go with, your opponent may try to sort of hit back and use certain definitions to try to knock you out of topicality. For example, let me just give you one example. Linz wrote some stuff that basically suggests that authoritarianism is different from totalitarianism. Whereas totalitarianism is based on some ideology, like a communist country is based on communist ideology, or an Islamic republic or dictatorship might be based on Islamic ideology. Authoritarianism is based simply on the authority of the leader. It doesn't appeal to any larger ideology. The leader is the leader because they're the leader, right? And what they say goes, not because of any, particular ideology. Now, this is a fairly out there definition of authoritarianism. I wouldn't try to run this distinction, but do be aware that there are some more nuanced definitions of it that could be used to sort of kick you out of topicality on certain things, and just be aware of that and be ready to respond to those. So, for example, if you really wanted to be a hardliner and say you can't be governed by an ideology, and then in your case you were running Saudi Arabia, someone might say, well, Saudi Arabia is not authoritarian. It's, is an Islamic republic. It's driven by Islamic ideology. And because it's driven mainly by an ideology rather than the personality of one specific leader, it's not authoritarian. That's really cute. It's too cute for me. I wouldn't run it, but you need to be aware that there are these sort of fine, nuanced, very narrow definitions, and be ready, for example, if you have to have a topicality fight on that. So in addition to that, maybe not in the case itself, I might think about having a sort of more objective standard, like an actual list of countries that are considered authoritarian. If you go just to the Wikipedia entry, the standard that they use on Wikipedia is they list all the countries deemed by the interest group Freedom House as having the not free designation, right? And if you look to that, is it perfect? No. I mean, every standard is going to have its own sort of subjective elements to it, but by having a sort of list and saying, here is a standard, here is a group that has gone through and analyzed these countries and designated these as being not free, we can deem them as being authoritarian. That is, something to have in your back pocket. It's interesting, if you look at the Freedom House list, two countries that come up a lot in the discussion of this topic, or have so far, the Philippines and Colombia, according to Freedom House, would not make the list as authoritarian countries. They're listed as partly free as opposed to not free. So again, just emphasizing the fact that there is a lot of room to fight over particular cases of countries being authoritarian or not being authoritarian. And again, the best advice is hedge your bets, right? Don't rely exclusively on one country. If it's debatable, if we're talking about partly free countries like Pakistan, like Colombia, maybe just don't run them as examples. And best of all, use studies that analyze large numbers of countries. Use evidence and data that looks at large numbers of countries so that you don't have to rely exclusively on one country or primarily on one country, and avoid those sort of topicality fights. Next definition is military aid. And here again on this, I would probably play it conservative. I would run my case aimed on both sides, both on the affirmative and the negative, at things that I think we can all agree are forms of military aid. And let me explain what I mean by that. So, for example, if you look at this definition from 2018 Council on Foreign Relations article by James McBride, it sums up military aid as being, financing for the purchasing of U.S. military equipment, which, by the way, is sort of the most common form of military aid, training foreign military personnel, and funding peacekeeping missions. Okay, so you'll note that McBride's definition is fairly conservative and narrow. For example, it leaves out counter-narcotics funding. It actually says that that's something separate called non-military security assistance, right? A more inclusive definition might come from the Center for Public Integrity in 2007. It defines military aid as taxpayer-funded programs or assistance that contribute to a nation's offensive military capabilities. And then it lists a number of types, and some of them include foreign military financing, right? This is basically where the United States Treasury helps a foreign country buy usually U.S.-made weapons, right? Either with grants or very favorable loans. It lists the Economic Support Fund, which these are grants provided to countries not necessarily for military equipment specifically, but to offset that country's military costs. International Military Education and Training, or IMET, which is just training military leaders in other countries by U.S. military personnel. And then finally, it does include counter-narcotics funding. So, for example, if you want to use counter-narcotics funding as a form of military assistance, we're going and interdicting drugs somewhere around the world, you need to be very careful about which definition you use, because there is a dispute as to whether those are considered military aid. Also note that neither one of these definitions includes military bases. When you first start Googling on this topic, you will come upon a number of articles that talk about military aid in the context of how we need military bases in countries around the world. But the consensus of the literature seems to be that military bases are not in and of themselves a form of military aid. So again, if you decide to run a case that is heavy on arguments about why, for example, we need bases in certain countries that may not be particularly democratic for strategic reasons, realize you run the risk of having to have a topicality fight about that, right? Now, of course, you could have a situation where maybe the price of having the base in the country is that we give military aid, and that'd be fine. But the base itself, there is a strong argument to be made that it is not a form of military aid. A couple more terms really quickly. Ought, I don't think is going to be a subject of a ton of debate on this topic. You might get into the usual ought implies a moral obligation point. I don't think it matters a whole lot in this case, because typically the main advantage of saying ought implies a moral obligation is that it sort of relieves the affirmative of a duty to sort of explain how they could plausibly do whatever the resolution says, right? In other words, if something would be impractical or not feasible to do, like provide a right to housing for everyone, well, then the affirmative might say, well, the resolution says ought, and that just means I have a moral obligation. I don't have to explain how it would happen. But in this case, what the resolution is saying is, let's stop doing something we already do. Let's stop paying money. I mean, obviously that's feasible. So I don't know that the ought moral obligation issue is going to come up a whole lot here. Thankfully, I think that's good. And then lastly, of course, there's the United States. And as usual, what I would say is you have to be prepared for the possibility you'll have some, weird person out there who'll run a case about the United States of Mexico, or the United States being the individual states. That's not too common, thank goodness. Don't do it yourself, but, you have to be prepared for that kind of stuff. So overall, I think that the ambiguity on two of the major terms in the resolution counsels in favor of being careful, right? Going with studies that encompass a lot of different countries, hedging your bets and using a lot of different examples, rather than putting, for example, all your money on Saudi Arabia, putting all your money on certainly not the Philippines. And then, also being careful with, how we define what military aid is. I think there's enough literature out there that you don't have to be too risky in either one of these areas in order to be successful. So for values and criterion, let's start with the affirmative. Broadly speaking, on the AF, I am a fan of morality. I think morality is a good general value. I'll explain why in just a second. There's a reason it's so common, right? But the resolution does include the word ought, and there's always the sort of fallback position that ought is a sort of moral mandate. I also think that intuitively the affirmative is just going to be saying, look, you're helping really awful people do really awful things, and we really don't necessarily need to wade into the particular consequences, that's just inherently bad. And I think, that morality fits well with that sort of narrative. So I think it'll work well here. But look, and this is the reason why I like morality. Let's just be honest. On this particular resolution and in general, your value is rarely going to win around for you. I mean, if it's been your experience that's different, I'd love to hear from you. But most of the time, the value is not going to win the round, but it can lose the round for you if you get too cute or creative. If you use something that's really abstract or esoteric, and your opponent can say that's not really a value at all, it's just some contingent thing that might be useful in certain circumstances, right? The goal of a value in my mind, right, is to sort of sit quietly in the round, not attract a lot of attention, and not be a target. It's to sort of be that lodestar up in the sky that you're trying to reach. That's what it literally is in the case, right? And for it to sort of sit there, and for your opponent and your judge to both say, well, yeah, I mean, obviously, if they achieve that, whatever that is, that value, then clearly they should win, because no one disputes that's an important value. No one disputes that it's applicable here. It may always be applicable. And I think morality does that. It's just very difficult. If you want to spend a bunch of time reading pre-written cards about, sort of morality, you can, but it's not a terribly common thing, because morality is just kind of that placeholder, right? And it sort of just sits up there and it looks nice, and it's not really going to draw a lot of attention. Your opponent might use it as well. I would stay away on the AF from the other traditional value that's used a lot, which is justice, because this is a resolution about sort of the real world in the international arena among countries who do really bad things, right? Justice seems to sound a lot like sort of an aspirational goal of what we do within a democratic nation state. There's a strong argument that these folks in countries like, Syria, like Saudi Arabia, who are being oppressed, they're not going to get justice no matter what. Justice is what every person is due, and unfortunately, it's just not on the table here. So justice seems to be a little bit of a difficult fit. Could you make it work? Yeah, of course you could make it work, but it would be a little bit of an odd fit. I don't think the value matters too much on the affirmative. Frankly, I think the much bigger question for the affirmative is which of two types of criterion you're going to use. And I think you have a big choice to make here. Are you going to go the deontological route? And by deontological, I mean this is wrong as a matter of principle. Some core principled argument, right? Like, Kant's categorical imperative is the traditional one, but there are many others. Or on the other hand, are you going to go the consequentialist utilitarian route, where instead of saying this is just wrong because it's wrong as a matter of principle, we're going to say it's wrong because it has bad effects. It's wrong because it harms the world and makes the world worse, right? And that's the basic choice. Now, certainly you can have illustrations of consequences in a deontological case, happens all the time, but this is going to be the basic choice that determines whether your case is mainly focused on more the philosophical arguments or mainly focused more on the concrete impacts, right? So if you were to go with what we call the deontological approach, I think one, strong candidate for this is the idea of avoiding complicity in unjust actions, right? And this is something that goes all the way back to Thomas Aquinas and all the way up to modern scholars like Chiara Lapora and Robert Gooden, who wrote a great book called Complicity and Compromise. And I wish I could get a copy of this. Unfortunately, I don't have one. I was able to read some excerpts from it. If you want to go look it up, I will include a link to at least a review of it. It's a great book about what it means to be complicit in bad acts in international relations, and it talks all about how there are certain circumstances where in international relations, international aid, military intervention, things like that, you may have to sort of work with bad people, right? And it looks at when you should do that and when you shouldn't. But, one deontological possibility is avoiding complicity with bad acts. Anytime you provide, aid in the form of military supplies or military help to a country that's doing bad, violent things, you take on the moral responsibility, and you should just not do that, right? Another possibility is categorical imperative, right? We could not, make a general rule of providing this aid to these bad countries. There have been too many bad cases, too many bad examples of how they've, murdered people and engaged in oppression. You cannot universalize this rule, as Kant would say, right? And therefore, you can't have it be deontologically correct. Now, if you're going to go the utilitarian route, I kind of like good old-fashioned sort of rule utilitarianism, right? From Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Stuart Mill, and let me explain why, right? I wouldn't want to use act utilitarianism on this topic, because I think one of the things that especially if I'm the AF, right? Because one of the things I think the neg is going to say is, rather than saying that, get rid of all military aid, they'll say do it on a case-by-case basis, right? An act utilitarianism, where we evaluate the cost-benefit ratio, right? The harm-to-benefit ratio of every specific instance of giving aid, right? Well, that would seem to play into the negative's hands of saying, yes, let's not get rid of it entirely, let's do it on a case-by-case basis. Rule utilitarianism, on the other hand, argues that we have to look at what achieves the greatest good for the greatest number, but we have to look at which rule would accomplish that. We need to pick between one or another general rule, as opposed to trying to do it on an individual case-by-case basis, right? And what this means is, basically, you need to look at a world in which we have this military aid to these authoritarian countries and a world where we don't. And you need to pick between those two potential rules. We either do it or we don't. And there's actually a strong practical argument for this, right? Because the idea that we can go on a case-by-case basis and make good decisions and allocate this aid only in places where it will be just and won't do more harm, our historical record shows that we're just not capable of doing that, right? We've even got a law out there, the Leahy Law, and we're going to talk about this in just a little bit. We've got a law that already exists on the books that tells us that we need to be looking at, each individual case of military aid to make sure that we're not providing aid to countries engaged in human rights violations. And we've done a terrible job of enforcing it. Courts have done a terrible job of enforcing it. Congress has done a terrible job of enforcing it. So the basic idea is that we can't do this on a case-by-case basis. Therefore, under rule utilitarianism, we just need to make a binary choice. In which case is the world better? The world where we provide military aid to these countries, or the world where we don't? And we're going to show you, for practical reasons, through all these harms, about why the world where we don't is better. So, values and criterion for the negative, right? I would strongly suggest for the negative a value of something that utilitarian, and I would specify it to sort of act utilitarianism, right? The negative is going to want to lean toward this standard, because basically, look, it's very hard for the negative to stand purely on principle here and say, yes, military aid is good. It's been great, and we endorse it fully in principle, right? The whole idea behind the negative is we're going to be helping out people who do bad things sometimes, right? Because it will achieve a greater good. So if you use a deontological standard, right, you're probably going to lose, because it's very difficult to do that. If you use like a virtue ethics standard, which is about like what good people do, again, it's going to be a hard slog, because saying selling arms to dictators is what good people do is a pretty tough sell. Right? So I think something along the lines of the greatest good for the greatest number, something along the lines of reducing human suffering, improving quality of life, these are all potential values for the negative. I would also say that you need a criterion that is rooted in realism, practicality. This is what the real world looks like. One philosopher who deals with this in the area of international relations is Hans Morgenthau. And he has some very good ideas in this area. To make a very long story short, and we'll put links to some of the things he's written and also some good summaries in the notes below. But his basic contribution is to remind us that these universal moral principles that might guide us as individuals or within the social contract within a nation state can't be readily applied to international relations, because in international relations you're in this sort of Hobbesian state of nature, law of the jungle situation, where there's nobody there to impose moral absolutes. And when he writes, he has multiple principles, and they're very complex, and you probably can't use all of them because some of them are even contradictory. But he has this fourth principle that says very simply, in international relations, moral principles have to be filtered through the lens of the particular circumstances, right? And basically, you can't say whether an action is moral or immoral in international relations without looking at the practical consequences, right? So maybe a criterion of something like, Hans Morgenthau's fourth principle of looking at the practical consequences of action or inaction. In other words, let's be realists. Let's look at whether this is going to help or hurt people. I think that's a good candidate for a criterion for the negative. And so that's, the basics in terms of some options for the affirmative and the negative in terms of value and criterion. I don't really think this is going to be a topic on which values and criterion are dominating the rounds. I think it's going to be sort of a more practical, maybe definitions-based, certainly impact-based debate. And And frankly, I'm thankful for that. And so with that, let's move on to the part we've all been waiting for, which is the part where we talk about actual affirmative contentions and later on some negative contentions. Okay, so starting out on the affirmative side, there's a ton of good literature out there on a lot of different fronts to support the idea that military aid just isn't doing what it's supposed to do. If you ask me, put a gun to your head, which side has more of an advantage in this case, I would probably say it's the AF. I think the negative has a little bit more of a strategic position, but I think the AF does have, I think, the overall strength in terms of the quantity and quality of the literature. I want to look at three sort of ideas that I would include as potential arguments for the AF, starting with one that I think you can use either in a sort of consequentialist case or in a sort of more ontological, morality-based case, and it's the idea of what I would call reverse solvency. In other words, a military aid doesn't achieve its stated ends. I call it reverse solvency because normally the goal of the AF is to solve a problem, right? At least in a policy case, the goal is to solve a problem. In this case, we're sort of condemning a solution by saying it doesn't solve the problem that it's supposed to solve. And if you look at this source, this is Sullivan and Tessman 2011. It basically concludes, after pretty extensive research, that military aid doesn't even achieve its stated end of encouraging compliance with U.S. policy goals. In other words, the more aid you give, on average, the less cooperation you get. It says, with limited exceptions, increasing levels of U.S. military aid significantly reduce cooperative foreign policy behavior with the United States. In other words, we're getting the exact opposite of what we want. The whole idea of military aid is to make a country more cooperative with U.S. military ends. Now, put a pin in that, right? Because you might say, well, U.S. military ends might be bad. They might be ill-advised. They might be inhumane. They can have all sorts of problems. I agree with that, right? We'll come back to that in just one second, though. This is a really well-structured study, though, that it's essentially a regression analysis, right? So what it looks at is how much military aid changes behavior. It essentially controls for other variables, like, for example, how likely was this state to agree with us, absent military aid? How much does it have in common with us politically? And it sort of regresses out the increased probability, or in this case, decreased probability of cooperating with the U.S. that comes from military aid. In addition, as a bonus, it summarizes a large body of prior literature that also generally supports the conclusion that military aid doesn't work when you try to change the behavior of the states that receive it. So you can actually mine this article for other sources if you want to and have a variety of them. It's got, over a half dozen very well-sourced, very well-written sources, right? So you might say, but okay, fair enough, but what if U.S. military goals are bad? What is the ultimate impact of this? The ultimate impact on the decision calculus, I think, is fairly simple. If you're in an ethical quandary, right, and you want to achieve A, but it might be at the cost of B, and B is a bad thing, but then you realize that you're not going to achieve A in the first place, well then, ethical quandary solved. Let me give you an example. Let's say that they had some basketball shoes on sale, and you were asking yourself, should I buy these basketball shoes? They'll make me better at basketball, but they're made in sweatshops under inhumane conditions, and that's a real ethical problem. But then you found out that the basketball shoes actually don't make you better at basketball at all. There's an overwhelming body of literature that suggests that these basketball shoes actually make you worse at basketball. Well, then you don't even have to resolve the ethical quandary because there's no reason to buy the shoes, right? And so one idea is you can sort of cut the Gordian knot here, whether you're in a consequentialist case or a deontological case, you can sort of cut the Gordian knot and say, look, you don't even necessarily need to reach these difficult ethical questions of whether it's ever okay to work with bad people, because that question assumes that working with bad people is going to achieve good ends. And the fact is, this study shows not only does it not achieve that, but overall, if we do a deep statistical analysis, it actually makes us in the United States, makes us slightly less likely to have cooperation with our goals. Another source that dovetails very nicely with this is the Rand Corporation 2014 study that we've got here. It does two things that I like a lot. First of all, it emphasizes that even if you sort of think that military aid may have some benefits in some circumstances, it says that the best evidence out there suggests that it's uniquely ineffective in authoritarian states. So basically what this study concludes is if military aid ever works to change the behavior of the recipient, it's least likely to work when you're giving it to authoritarian states. And that's sort of a nice little bonus to go with the Sullivan source that I mentioned earlier. And then the other thing that this article does, that the Rand Corporation does, is it explains why military aid doesn't do a good job of changing the behavior of authoritarian states. And basically what it is look, these authoritarian states look around the world and they see two things, right? First, they see that all these other countries are getting military aid from the United States. In many cases, they're not doing what the United States wants them to do, right? And they're continuing to receive the aid. So Egypt, for example, can basically tell us to, to go jump in a lake when it comes to them, reforming their justice system, when it comes to them not oppressing dissidents, when it comes to them, not sort of suppressing protest movements. And guess what? They still get over $1 billion in aid, right? The second thing they see is that, if they were to go and do what we asked them to do, if they were to go and accomplish all the things that they have on their list, go get rid of this insurgent group, go get rid of this terrorist group, reform your politics, what would be the result? Well, they're betting the result is if they did everything that we asked them to do, we wouldn't need them anymore, and we would take away their aid, right? Or at least we would dramatically reduce it. And then if you go back to the Sullivan piece, what they actually find is that empirically, that's what happens, right? When a country fully complies and does the things that the United States wants it to do, they're actually more likely to see their aid reduced. So what we do is we create this perverse incentive, right, to not comply, or to at least only partially grudgingly comply, because you're going to keep your aid even if you disagree with the United States. The only way you could lose it is to do what we tell you to do, right? So this is a very strong argument. I think no matter how you're running your case, if the argument, look, you basically say, proponents of military aid to these dictatorships, you've got these stated goals of influencing these countries. They're not happening. So before you even reach my second contention, third contention, my ethical arguments, my critique, whatever you want it to be, about why this is bad and problematic and harmful, you're not even doing what you set out to achieve. And I think this is a good way to start almost any case on the AF. And it's got good literature to support it. The next argument I would make is a sort of straight up utilitarian argument, which is basically the idea that military aid to authoritarian regimes results in more violence, more human rights abuses, and more deaths. Now, we're going to link to a number of studies and sources on this, and you should go and read the literature on your own. There's no substitute for that. To save time, I want to talk about the one card that I think is probably the strongest overall card on this, and this is a study that comes from the Omilacheva. It's in the Political Science Quarterly from back in 2017. Actually, Omilacheva is not the only author. It's 3 authors. You're going to have to say a lot if you cite it. But basically what this finds, and you're going to flash this up on the screen here, you see what it says is like the total amount of U.S. military aid has a positive and statistically significant impact on civilian deaths, suggesting that greater amounts of overall U.S. military assistance are associated with more civilian atrocities. In other words, the more money we give in military aid, the more atrocities we see committed against civilians. Holding all other variables constant, as you can see here, and that's important, remember, because if we weren't holding other variables constant, this would just be some loose correlation. It might be that these just happen to be violent countries to begin with. But holding all other variables, including the violence of the country to begin with, constant, we expect the deaths to increase by a factor of 1.06 for each unit increase in U.S. military assistance. That is huge. I had to ask some folks here at MSU who know something about stats to explain this coefficient thing to me. But basically what a 1.06 coefficient means is that for every dollar you spend in military aid to these countries, right, you're going to get 0.6 more deaths. Or another way of saying it is that for every $1,000, right, you're going to get 60 more deaths, right? And so on and so forth. For every $1 million you spend, you're going to be looking at 60,000 more civilian deaths. Now, obviously, it's going to taper off at some point. I probably wouldn't go into the round and say, our budget is $1 billion, therefore we're causing 60 million deaths. That seems a little implausible. But the idea of a positive correlation, a statistically significant positive correlation between the more we spend and the more deaths of innocent people and atrocities in these countries, I think is a very strong piece of evidence. It's well written, it's well sourced by some well-regarded scholars, and I think it would be a good piece of evidence in any sort of utilitarian case where we're talking about the consequences. We'll also link to some other sources about how arms sales are going to make coups more likely, like military takeovers, that leads to longer military rule and more deaths. We'll link to a Blanton 1999 article about how arms sales generally lead to more violence, maybe not more deaths, but more, violence in these societies. But I think the strongest one is this Omolacheva card that just talks about the more we spend, the more deaths to civilians and atrocities that we can expect. And I think that straight up utilitarian argument, especially that straight up utilitarian argument is one that is going to be, I think, very powerful with many judges. And so lastly for the AF, if we're looking at a more deontological approach to things, a more objective right and wrong, less of a utilitarian approach, complicity, the idea of moral complicity with wrongdoing is, I think, probably the go-to approach. There are other ways you could go, but this one seems to be the simplest to me. Because I don't think most people are going to object to the idea that a lot of the things that these regimes like Saudi Arabia, historically regimes like Chile, have done under these dictators are bad. There's not going to be a lot of objection to that. The question is whether we as the United States share the moral culpability for the things that they're doing, right? And so moral complicity, again, is just the idea that if you assist bad actors, bad people doing bad things with bad motivations, then you yourself are deemed complicit and have acted immorally and share the blame, right? Earlier we said if you want a philosopher to read for this, look to Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas obviously is one of the pillars of Western thought, and he says that there are 9 different ways to be complicit in immoral activity, and number 8 is simply failing to act when you could do something to stop a harm, right? And of course, as the United States, we are well aware of the things that we are doing, the things that our aid is being used to do, from Augusto Pinochet in the 1970s in Chile, the CIA propping up his regime, allowing him to carry out, oppression and repression and murder of his own people, all the way to what Saudi Arabia is doing today. We're not innocent. We know exactly what's going on. And so Aquinas would say, that's all you need, right? You knew it was going to happen. You did it anyway. You are morally culpable, right? Now, if you don't want to use Aquinas, and there are some reasons why you might not, right? He is, of course, explicitly a Christian philosopher. Nothing wrong with that. Doesn't change the validity of his ideas, but it could open up his theories to attack, because they are based on a particular set of religious beliefs. If you don't want to go with him, there are more contemporary philosophers you can use, like Brian Lawson of the University of Western Ontario from 2011. And what Lawson writes is the fact that an individual recognizes, or even that she could reasonably be expected to recognize, in other words, even if you don't actually know if a person with common sense or a country with common sense would figure this out, that she is contributing to a harm, that gives us reason to describe their behavior as a contribution to the harm and to secure moral responsibility. Thus, he writes, I am accountable for what others do when I knowingly contribute to a harmful outcome that results from the contribution, even if what I did ultimately wasn't the deciding factor, even if it wasn't strictly necessary, he says, the fact that I knew that a harm was happening and I went along with it, that's enough to secure culpability. And I think this is a really good, simple, plain language explanation of complicity, right? Because the key is that you did it knowingly. Because there are philosophers out there who deal with things like agency theory, and there's not even close to enough time to talk about that. But the idea is that you, as one moral agent, can't be culpable for the actions of another, moral agent. And what Lawson does is he sort of cuts through that and says, look, we're not going to get into the agency theory of whether I'm responsible for what they did. I have my own responsibility. I did a morally culpable thing by being complicit in a bad act. In other words, my complicity by itself is a bad act. It doesn't matter if I'm fully responsible for the things they did. I myself did a bad thing, right? And so, just as a practical example of what that would mean, if I read in my son's journal and I find out that he wants to go shoot another student at school, and then he asks me for a gun for Christmas, and I give it to him, right? Well, it doesn't matter, maybe in my heart of hearts, I subjectively wish that he would go out and take up target shooting or take up deer hunting, right? If I knew what he was likely to do, and then I went along with it anyway, then Lawson would say, and Aquinas would say, that I bear the same moral responsibility, or at least I bear moral responsibility. I'm complicit and therefore I am to blame. And so, for example, when we look at Saudi Arabia, when we look at Egypt, we know the things that they're doing to repress their own citizens. We know the things that Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen. We continue to provide this aid, which enables it. We are morally responsible for it. That's a simple, straightforward argument under complicity. One last little wrinkle under complicity is that there may be, in addition to the moral argument of complicit responsibility, there may actually be a legal argument. Human Rights Watch in 2004 had this article that talks about how under the International Law Commission's articles on responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts, there's an argument that you can interpret that to say, look, if you knowingly contribute to human rights violations, you take action or fail to take action knowing that they're likely to occur, that you might be responsible under international law as well as just purely morally responsible. So you might be able to potentially link to some impacts from either violating international law, which is bad for the United States, or if you don't care about international law, and if you've seen some of our other videos, you know that it can be kind of tough to enforce, reducing respect for international law. In other words, if you ignore it and violate it and you just don't care, then you reduce respect for it. But either way, there may be a legal angle as well. So that's the basic deontological angle that at least we're looking at. And so with that, we will now move on and talk about some of the core arguments that the negative can make. Okay, so turning to the negative, I think, as we said earlier, the biggest problem the negative has is the idea of trying to sort of square up directly with the affirmative and say, yes, military aid has historically been a good thing when applied to these authoritarian regimes, that there's an empirical historical record that it's good. You're just going to get overwhelmed with example after example of the harms that it's done. Even if you have a little bit to push back with, you're probably going to get outweighed. So I think squaring up to that big fortress of evidence that the AF has is not a good idea. You have to be a little bit more strategic about how you come at it. And I think the best way to do that, the first thing we're going to talk about is framing the burden that the affirmative has as the burden of proving a categorical or at least a very strongly general statement, right? Not asking, has military aid to authoritarian regimes generally been good, but asking whether or not it should ever be an option. And this is what I call my sort of case-by-case tool in a toolbox theory of the negative, right? And so what the negative is going to say is, look, it's not my job as the neg to show you that every instance of military aid has been good, or even that the majority of instances of military aid has been good. It's the affirmative's burden to prove that the resolution is a true statement. Resolved, the United States ought not provide military aid to authoritarian regimes. That is a general statement, right? So the affirmative's duty is to show you a general or potentially categorical rule that this aid is not acceptable. My job is to give you examples of how you should look at it on a case-by-case basis. And if at the end of the round what you believe is that we ought to be looking at it case by case based on the type of aid, based on the country, based on the specific situation, then even if you believe the majority of cases historically have been bad, the resolution is still not a true statement, right? This is the case-by-case advocacy for the negative. And there are linguistic principles, there are principles of language that support this, right? The resolution talks about military aid to authoritarian regimes. And authoritarian regimes is what we call a bare plural, right? It's a plural noun that does not have a qualifier like all or some or most or whatever to tell you like how many or what percentage of these that we're talking about, right? And so that is a source of some ambiguity. Are we talking about like just one authoritarian regime? Could you as the AF pick one and run a case solely about that? Or would you maybe, because it's plural, have to pick two, but that would be sufficient, right? But there's a principle of interpretation about bare plurals that I think helps resolve that, which is that when the object is a normative statement, like a debate resolution, it really undercuts the whole point of making sort of a normative statement, like a proposed rule, to have a plural interpreted as being just like one or a few. Let me explain what I mean. If we were to have a resolution that said outside hunting season, you may not shoot animals. Well, we don't have a qualifier for animals. It doesn't say all animals. So I guess in theory, you could come in and say animals means any two animals, which would mean that the statement outside hunting season, you may not shoot animals would be satisfied as long as there are at least two non-shot animals. You can shoot all the other animals. Well, that would be an absurd interpretation of the resolution, you may not shoot animals, right? And so when we're talking about a statement that is a normative rule categorical statement, which is what most people generally accept that debate resolutions are. We need to look at how people really speak and how they really write in the real world. And usually when they don't qualify that plural like authoritarian regimes, what they mean is all, right? If you say, do not take cookies from the cookie jar, that doesn't mean you can leave 2 cookies in there and take all the rest of them, right? That's just not how normal people talk. And so when we say you may not give aid or you ought not give aid to authoritarian regimes, what we're asking you to do, affirmative, is to provide a categorical rule. And so my job as the negative is simply to show you that there are cases in which it can be beneficial, right? And in which we ought to do it on a case-by-case basis, right? And you need to have specific examples. The biggest one that you can cite, as we talked about earlier in the video, is the Lend-Lease Act and the USSR prior to and during our involvement in World War II. Beginning in March 1941, as we mentioned earlier, the United States was shipping thousands and thousands of tons of material and weapons and ammunition and supplies to the USSR, which unquestionably was an authoritarian regime. And unquestionably, this was the right thing to do because it was the best way at the time of stopping the advance of the Third Reich and Hitler and the Nazis, right? And no one seriously believes that this was something that we shouldn't have done, right? And essentially that is the sort of tool in the toolbox argument. I'll offer that and some other examples. I'll show you that while there might be some examples of how we've done it poorly, there are examples in which it's good. And so if you do it on a case-by-case basis, you vote negative. And there are other examples of how aid to authoritarian countries can work. For example, in that same article by Oma Lecheva that we cited earlier for the affirmative, there's actually a section that talks about how certain specific types of military aid actually do a good job of reducing, at least slightly reducing, civilian deaths. And particularly IMET, or military training, military education and training, has a small but non-trivial correlation with reducing civilian deaths. And so, for example, if we should look at it on a case-by-case basis and maybe approve training for these authoritarian countries, even if we don't approve arms sales, right? Then again, we look at each proposal, we look at each possibility one by one, and that means we don't accept the categorical statement of the affirmative. I think this is something that you have to seriously consider on a resolution where you don't have the ability to sort of square up as easily, right? And so the second thing we want to talk about is the idea of solvency, the question of whether the resolution is actually going to do any good. And I think that there is an argument that the negative can make that there is a big solvency deficit on the part of the affirmative. In other words, you can take away military aid, but it's not going to change behavior. And the biggest reason why it's not going to change behavior is that these countries are just going to seek other patron states, other superpowers, who will arguably have even worse incentives, who arguably will be even less concerned with human rights than the United States is, right? So, for example, it's not like Egypt and Turkey and Saudi Arabia and the Philippines, if we were to take away all of their military aid, are just going to throw up their hands and shrink their militaries and stop abusing human rights. They're going to seek help. They're going to seek help elsewhere, right? That's exactly what Pakistan did earlier this year. When the United States withdrew aid, Pakistan turned around immediately and went to China and Russia and asked them for help in making up the suspended $2 billion in military aid from the United States. In September 2018 of this year, China actually committed to $60 billion in security aid to countries in the Sahel region of Africa and in the African Union. So China is clearly in the market to fill any void that the United States leaves. So any sort of real world impact that the AF cites of reducing, whatever the harms are of military aid, the response will be China, potentially Russia, are right there and ready to swoop in. And so the argument would be, look, if these weapons and this aid is going to be provided anyway, right? Why not at least just keep our whatever influence and leverage we have, right? Why not keep at least some degree of leverage and some degree of influence and the ability to sort of monitor and whatever other benefits we get? Because if they're going to be getting it anyway, what's the problem? Now, there's a limit to this, right? Obviously, for example, if I said, my neighbor down the street is beating his kids with golf clubs, therefore I ought to be the one to provide him with golf clubs, because at least that way I'll be able to check in on him periodically, and maybe I'll be able to lobby him to beat his kids less often. At some point it's just wrong to give people golf clubs to beat their children with, regardless of whether they might do it independently of you. But at least on a case-by-case basis, again, if you use that framework, you can say we should at least look at it on a case-by-case basis. And if, for example, if a country is not a very serious violator of human rights, and we know they're going to turn immediately to China, for example, like some of these subsaharan sub-Saharan countries, then maybe we ought to consider carefully whether to just continue to provide at least some forms of aid as opposed to this categorical statement that we shouldn't. Another way in which you could have a solvency problem as the affirmative, and another argument the negative can make, is that authoritarian regimes, there is good evidence that they will simply shift non-military monetary aid to the military. Remember, money is fungible, and there's good evidence out there that even if we attach strings to it, even if we try not to, these countries find a way to sort of bleed international aid for humanitarian purposes and for non-military purposes to move it over, or at least replace other funding and have it eventually benefit the military. So the impact would be, number one, the military funding is still going to be there. Number two, it might siphon away money that should have gone to humanitarian purposes. Money that should have been going to food and schools is now going to be used to prop up the military. So taking away this aid will ultimately only have the effect of depriving people of domestic things that they need that we provide aid for. So I do think that this is a good angle to attack on a practical perspective, saying, look, you're not going to solve anything here. They're going to get military aid. We might as well, at least in some cases, be the ones to provide it. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in the negative is what I guess I would categorize as sort of a critical negative. It's not critical in the sense that it's sort of traditionally sort of, I guess you'd say, like left-leaning, or even necessarily about, for example, identities like race or religion, although it does have something to do with that. It's more critical in the sense that it looks at the language of the resolution and says, hey, there's a problem with this. And the specific term that I think could be problematic is authoritarian regimes, right? Calling large swaths of countries, large groups of countries, authoritarian, and then concluding that the United States is not authoritarian, and thus we have the ability and are in a moral position to judge their worthiness for military aid. It's problematic on a lot of levels, right? Okay, so first of all, authoritarian regime is an impossibly vague and loaded term. It can mean a lot of different things, from, for example, whether you have elections at all, to more nuanced questions of how much dissent and disagreement there is, how much of a free press there is. And as Marlise Glasius points out, that when we talk about an authoritarian regime, we really are focusing on the wrong thing. It's this very vague term that doesn't really have a lot of meaning. We shouldn't be looking at whether something is an authoritarian regime, because that just asks, how did the regime come to power? Are there elections? Things like that. We should be asking about whether it's engaged in specific authoritarian, inhumane, unjust acts. In other words, you should look at how the regime acts, what it does. Is it violating human rights? Is it committing atrocities? Is it going overseas and violating the human rights of people outside the country? Is it doing authoritarian things? Not, is it an authoritarian regime? In other words, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then we ought to treat it like a duck. If it doesn't, then maybe we shouldn't, right? And so the big problem that Glasius points out is this idea of an authoritarian regime is arbitrary, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense, and it doesn't look to what the regime is actually doing. Further, she says that this creates a real double standard, because there are a lot of countries out there that are not authoritarian. They are clearly liberal democracies that engage in, humanitarian and human rights violations. The biggest example in terms of receiving aid from the United States is Israel. Israel is one of the biggest recipients of U.S. military aid, but it's undisputed that there are numerous human rights abuses, numerous problems with how Israel treats Palestinians within its territory, with the positions that it's taken publicly on a lot of issues. And yet under this resolution, because it is a liberal democracy where the elections are real and there are opposing parties, we would say, well, that doesn't matter. That's fine. We can continue providing them with this aid, right? So the second problem is with the term authoritarian regime itself. So in addition to the practical impacts of drawing this line and sort of absolving, right, countries like Israel of their arguable misdeeds, right, while other countries are held accountable, the second harm would be that the term authoritarian regime itself lends legitimacy to this idea that if you have elections and you have opposition parties, then your misdeeds are okay, right? And you can see how this idea would be a troubling one in the world where some of the biggest human rights violations around the world are carried out by one of the biggest democracies, which is the United States. So her argument is simple. We shouldn't draw the line based on whether you have elections, based on whether you're an authoritarian. We should draw the line based on how you actually act, right? Because that results in better decisions. And it also doesn't lead to this false dichotomy where we absolve democracies of responsibility for the bad things they do. And luckily, and this is why I don't really call it a critical argument, luckily there's actually a policy that does that, and that is the Leahy Law, right? The Leahy Law that we talked about earlier is an existing law that requires the United States to go and investigate cases in which it provides military aid to make sure that it's not being funneled to units of militaries that actually engage in human rights violations. And Nathaniel Miller's article in the Cornell International Law Journal in 2012 talks about how we have this law. Unfortunately, it's not effectively enforced. Right? Congress refuses to enforce it. The courts, including the Supreme Court, have been very reluctant to provide a right to sue to enforce it. Right? And so the argument would be that there's a simple solution here. Right? What we ought to do is, instead of just completely barring any aid to a future ally like our USSR in World War II, instead of just making that categorical broad rule, why don't we just enforce the Leahy Law? The Leahy Law basically does what Glassius in her article says, which is, let's look at what they actually do. Let's look at if they're engaging in actual authoritarian rights, if they're engaging in actual gross human rights violations, and let's make that the standard rather than just using authoritarianism as this rough proxy, right? And so that, I think, provides an alternative standard. Reject the resolution. Instead, look to the behavior of the actual regime and do it that way, right? And so that is, I don't know if you'd call it a traditional sort of K, right, critical argument, but it is an argument about the language of the resolution. And so that sort of sums up some of the basic positions on the negative. And now to wrap up with just a few final thoughts. And that's it. So thanks for sticking with us. Listen, I know that January and February are important months for LD debate. I know some of you will have, for example, national qualifying tournaments. You'll be trying to get legs to the TOC. There are big invitationals. So for all of you going out there and trying your hand in those, the best of luck to you. Again, I think it's a good thing that you have a nice balanced resolution. Just be careful of some of those pitfalls with the definitions. Be sure you're strategic in positioning yourself, particularly on the negative. And I think you'll have a lot of fun with this one. Remember, as always, the timestamps for the sections and the notes are in the description below. Remember to check us out on Twitter just for a few periodic updates each month. We'll try to see if we can update particularly this resolution as it goes on and we see how it's actually playing out with some additional thoughts. And as always, go out there, work hard, read a lot, do your best, have fun, and as always, Hail State.